All right, so get this. Ready for this? President Trump just signed an executive order to create a U.S. sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
A sovereign wealth fund. Right here in the USA, we've got this Bloomberg law piece that's breaking it all down.
Yeah.
Some Getty images, pretty interesting ones. They captured the signing. And even some chatter about, get this, TikTok, getting tangled up on all this. So strap in. Because today we're diving deep into what this all means. And trust me, it's a lot more interesting than it might sound at first.
Yeah, it definitely raises some important questions. For a country that's historically relied on private investment, that's a pretty big shift in strategy.
Exactly. So first things first. For those of us who haven't been brushing up on our international finance lately, what exactly is the Sovereign Wealth Fund? I mean, it sounds kind of fancy, right?
It is a bit of a mouthful. Basically, it's a state-owned investment fund. Think of it like a giant pool of money that the government uses to invest in various assets with the aim of generating long-term wealth and supporting economic growth.
Okay, so it's like a national savings account.
Right.
But instead of stashing cash under the mattress, they're putting it to work in the markets. And other countries have been doing this for a while, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. Countries like Norway, for example, have been using sovereign wealth funds for decades, often fueled by revenue from natural resources like oil.
So Norway's basically sitting on a giant pile of oil money and using it to invest in all sorts of things.
Exactly. And it's been incredibly successful. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is now worth over $1 trillion, making it one of the largest in the world. It's helped them build a strong economy and provide a high standard of living for their citizens.
Wow, $1 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. Okay, so if other countries are already doing this and doing it well, why is it such a big deal for the U.S. to jump on board now?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a real departure from traditional U.S. economic policy, which has typically favored, private sector-led investment. This move suggests a shift towards a more active role for the government in managing and directing the economy.
Interesting. So this executive order, signed just a few days ago on February 3rd, 2025, could potentially change how things work in the U.S., but how quickly are we talking here? Will we see changes overnight?
Not quite overnight. But the executive order does call for the fund to be operational within 12 months, so it's definitely a fast-tracked initiative.
Wow, a year? That's pretty aggressive. It seems like the administration is really serious about this.
They've even appointed Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary nominee Howard Lutnick to lead the charge. So yeah, it's clearly a priority.
Big names, a tight timeline, and a whole lot of potential for change. This is already shaping up to be pretty interesting. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I just can't wrap my head around. This whole TikTok connection. I mean, what's that all about?
Yes, the TikTok twist. It's where things get a bit more complicated.
Right. Last year was all about banning TikTok.
Yeah.
Concerns about national security, all that. And now there's talk of it becoming part of this new sovereign wealth fund. It just seems like a complete 180.
It is a dramatic shift in strategy, that's for sure. But it's not entirely out of the blue. Remember, President Trump recently said he'd consider extending the deadline for the ban to make a deal to protect our national security. This could be that deal.
So instead of banning TikTok,
right,
they might just buy it.
Essentially, yes. Incorporating TikTok into the fund would give the U.S. government a level of control over the platform, potentially addressing those national security concerns that initially sparked the ban.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
But it's not just about national security, is it? This feels like a move with much bigger implications. I mean, you've got Microsoft, Elon Musk, even a Saudi prince all sniffing around, trying to get a piece of TikTok. This feels like it's about more than just a social media app.
You're absolutely right. TikTok, with its massive user base and advanced technology, has become a highly valuable asset, both financially and strategically. The fact that it's even being considered for inclusion in this new sovereign wealth fund shows you the kind of power and influence this fund could have.
So it's like the U.S. is trying to create a financial powerhouse, and they're looking at TikTok as a potential weapon in their arsenal.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And it raises some important questions about how this fund will be managed, what its investment priorities will be, and what impact it could have on the global economic landscape.
Okay, so we've got this brand new federal fund in the works, potentially with a chunk of TikTok in its portfolio. But it's not like the U.S. is starting from scratch, right? There are states that have already created their own sovereign wealth funds, right? What can the federal government learn from them?
That's a great point. The U.S. actually has a surprising number of successful state-level sovereign wealth funds that could serve as models for this new federal fund. In fact, there are two in particular that stand out: the Alaska Permanent Fund and the North Dakota Legacy Fund.
Okay, so we're going from the federal level down to the state level. Let's start with Alaska. What's so special about their fund?
Well, for starters, it's huge. The Alaska Permanent Fund, established back in 1976, is currently worth around $82 billion. It's primarily funded by oil revenues. And get this, every resident of Alaska receives a yearly dividend from the fund's earnings.
Wait, so every single person living in Alaska gets a check just for being an Alaskan? That's incredible. Like winning the lottery just for living there.
It's a pretty sweet deal, you have to admit. And it highlights one of the potential benefits of a well-managed sovereign wealth fund, the ability to share the wealth and create a more equitable society.
Okay, that's a point for the pro column. What about North Dakota? What's their story?
North Dakota's Legacy Fund is a bit newer, established in 2010. It's also funded by oil and gas tax revenue. And they have a really, really interesting system in place. Each month, 30% of that revenue goes straight into the fund.
So it's like they're automatically siphoning off a chunk of their oil money for the future.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's a clever way to ensure consistent contributions to the fund. But here's the really interesting part. Every 2 years, the state can access up to 5% of the fund to finance projects, provide tax relief, and address other budgetary needs.
So they're not just letting the money sit there, they're actually using it to make a difference in the state.
Exactly. It's a model that balances long-term wealth accumulation with more immediate economic benefits.
So we have two really different models here. One that provides direct benefits to citizens.
Yeah.
And another that focuses on long-term investment and strategic spending. It makes you wonder which approach the federal government will take with their new fund.
It's a good question, and it's just one of many questions that we'll be exploring as we dive deeper into this topic.
I'm ready to dive deeper as you.
Absolutely. This is just the tip of the iceberg. It really is. We've talked about what a sovereign wealth fund is, how other countries are using them, and even the potential inclusion of TikTok. But what I find really fascinating is thinking about the long game, the broader implications this could have for the U.S.
Okay, so let's step back from the headlines for a second. What are we talking about here? What are the big picture implications that have you, the expert, so intrigued?
Well, one of the most significant implications is the potential for the U.S. to finally tackle some of those massive, ambitious projects that have always seemed just out of reach.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of projects are we talking about?
Think major infrastructure improvements, high-speed rail lines connecting the coasts, a nationwide smart grid for energy efficiency, maybe even ambitious space exploration programs. These are projects that could have a transformative impact on the country. But they require enormous amounts of capital that hasn't always been readily available.
So you're saying this fund could be the key to unlocking those big, bold ideas that have been sitting on the shelf because of funding issues.
Exactly. And it's not just about the money itself. It's about sending a signal to the world that the U.S. is serious about investing in its future, in innovation, and in maintaining its global leadership.
That's a powerful message. But I'm also curious about how this fund could impact the U.S.'s role on the global stage. I mean, $1 trillion investment fund has to give you some serious clout now.
Absolutely. It could give the U.S. a lot more leverage in international economic relations and trade negotiations. Imagine being able to invest strategically in developing countries, fostering economic growth and stability in regions that are crucial to U.S. interests.
It's like using financial power to shape the global landscape.
In a way, yes. It's about strategically deploying resources to achieve economic and geopolitical goals.
And we can't forget about the whole digital asset and financial technology angle. I mean, the executive order specifically mentions U.S. dominance in this sector, right?
That's right. And that's where things get particularly interesting. Imagine this sovereign wealth fund investing in cutting-edge technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, and even cryptocurrencies. It could position the U.S. at the forefront of the digital financial revolution.
So instead of just reacting to changes in the global economy, the U.S. could be actively shaping the future of finance.
Precisely. It's a bold vision, and it remains to be seen how it will all play out, but the potential is certainly there.
Okay, so far we've mostly focused on the potential benefits. But what about the risks? I mean, putting this much financial power in the hands of the government have to raise some concerns, right?
Of course. Anytime you're dealing with this level of financial power, there are inherent risks. One of the biggest concerns is the potential for political influence to distort investment decisions.
So instead of making investments based on sound financial principles, There's a risk that political agendas could drive the decision-making process.
That's always a possibility. And it's something that will need to be carefully monitored. Transparency, accountability, and strong oversight mechanisms will be crucial to ensure that the fund is managed responsibly and ethically.
And what about the potential impact on the private sector? I mean, some people might argue that this is the government encroaching on territory. It's traditionally been the domain of private businesses.
That's a valid point. It will be important to strike a balance between public and private investment to ensure that the fund complements rather than competes with the private sector.
It sounds like we're entering uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
A lot of potential, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of questions that don't have easy answers.
That's the nature of groundbreaking initiatives like this. We're essentially writing the rule book as we go along.
It's like we're navigating through a financial fog with glimpses of a promising future, but also the potential for unexpected obstacles along the way.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for careful planning, strategic thinking, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential of this fund to finance ambitious projects, to reshape the global economic landscape, and to position the U.S. at the forefront of the digital financial revolution. But we've also acknowledged the risks, the potential for political interference, and the need for careful oversight.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's one that we'll continue to explore as this story unfolds.
Speaking of exploring, I'm curious about your thoughts on this whole TikTok situation. Do you think incorporating TikTok into the fund is a good idea?
It's a tough call. On the one hand, it could give the U.S. government more control over a platform that's become incredibly influential, especially among younger generations. But on the other hand, it raises concerns about government overreach and the potential for censorship.
It's a tricky balance for sure. And it'll be interesting to see how the administration navigates those competing interests.
Absolutely. It's a decision with far-reaching implications, and it's one that we'll be watching closely.
So we've talked about the potential benefits and risks of this new sovereign wealth fund, the lessons we can learn from state-level funds, and the potential inclusion of TikTok. It's a lot to process. What's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember from this discussion?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is a significant development with the potential to reshape the U.S. economy in profound ways. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it's one that deserves our attention.
Okay, listeners, you heard the expert. Pay attention. This is big. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've talked about the potential for the U.S. to use this fund to invest in its future, to shape the global economy, and to lead the way in digital finance. But ultimately, the success or failure of this initiative will depend on the choices we make, the investments we prioritize, and the values we uphold. It really feels like we're at a crossroads here. A moment where the U.S. could either double down on its traditional economic approach or chart a new course, one that embraces a more active role for the government in shaping the economy.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment, no doubt. And the choices made in the coming months and years will have a lasting impact, not just on the U.S. economy, but on the global financial landscape as a whole.
Okay, so let's play this out for a second. Let's say this sovereign wealth fund really takes off. It grows. It makes smart investments. It helps finance those big game-changing projects we talked about. What does that future look like? What's the best-case scenario here?
Well, in a best-case scenario, I think you could see a U.S. that's more competitive on the global stage with a stronger economy, a more modern infrastructure, and a renewed focus on innovation.
So we're talking about high-speed rail lines crisscrossing the country.
Yeah.
Cutting-edge research facilities, maybe even a U.S.-led mission to Mars, all thanks to the power of this sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah, it might sound like science fiction, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. Of course, there are challenges to overcome, risks to manage, and tough decisions to be made. But the potential is there.
That's the exciting part, isn't it? The unknown, the possibility that this could really be a game changer. But let's flip the script for a second. What about the potential downsides? What happens if this goes wrong? What's the worst case scenario?
Well, the biggest concern is that the fund could become a victim of political maneuvering, with investment decisions driven more by short-term political gains than by sound financial principles.
So instead of investing in projects that benefit the country as a whole, they end up funding pet projects for politicians or chasing after trendy investments that fizzle out.
Exactly. That's a That's a real risk, and it's one that could erode public trust in the fund and ultimately undermine its effectiveness.
And that could have a ripple effect throughout the economy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if people lose faith in the fund,
Yeah.
it could spook investors, weaken the dollar, and potentially even trigger a financial crisis.
Yeah, it's a possibility, though hopefully unlikely one. But it underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and strong oversight mechanisms to ensure that the fund is managed responsibly and ethically.
Okay, so there's a lot riding on this.
Yeah.
A lot of potential for both good and bad outcomes. It feels like the stakes are incredibly high.
There's no doubt about that. The creation of this sovereign wealth fund is a historic moment for the U.S., a moment that could define the country's economic future for generations to come.
It's almost too big to wrap your head around. All of the possibilities,
Yeah.
all the unknowns. But that's what makes this so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
We're witnessing history in the making, and we have no idea what the next chapter holds.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. It's a reminder that the future is not predetermined. It's something we create through our choices, our actions, and our collective vision.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to come back to something you said earlier. You mentioned that this is a pivotal moment for the U.S. What advice would you give to our listeners, to those of us who are trying to make sense of all this, to understand what it means for our own lives, our own futures?
My advice would be to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions about the implications of this new fund, and to hold our elected officials accountable for making wise and responsible decisions.
So don't just sit on the sidelines. Get involved, ask questions, make your voice heard.
Absolutely. The future of the U.S. economy is not something that's decided in some ivory tower. It's something we all have a stake in, and it's something we can all help to shape.
Well, listeners, there you have it. We've explored the ins and outs of President Trump's executive order to create a U.S. sovereign wealth fund, the potential benefits and risks, the lessons from state-level funds, the possible inclusion of TikTok, and the broader implications for the U.S. economy and its role in the world.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it's sparked some curiosity and some critical thinking among our listeners.
Me too, because ultimately that's what we're all about here at the Deep Dive, encouraging you to think deeply, to challenge assumptions,
Yeah.
and to engage with the world around you.
And to remember that even in the face of complex, seemingly overwhelming issues, there's always something we can do, something we can learn, and something we can contribute.
So keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to challenge your thinking and expand your understanding of the world. Until then, stay curious.